The restaurant smelled of garlic bread and simmering tomato sauce. Families filled the booths, kids running back and forth between tables while servers tried to balance plates of pasta and pitchers of soda. I walked in with the rest of my family and immediately felt that old, familiar sting in my chest. I already knew where I was supposed to sit before the hostess even gestured. There it was, an empty chair right by the swinging restroom doors. Every time the door opened, a gust of cold air brushed against the side of the table, along with the steady shuffle of strangers walking past. That chair had been mine for as long as I could remember, the one nobody else wanted. I sat down quietly, sliding into my place, while Celine, my older sister, claimed the middle of the table. She looked like she was hosting a gala rather than a casual family dinner at Olive Garden. "Celine, you look stunning tonight," Aunt Carla said, leaning across the table with admiration shining in her eyes. Mom smiled proudly and adjusted Celine's napkin as though she were polishing a trophy. Dad gave me a quick nod, barely acknowledgement, before diving into a conversation with my uncle about football. Nobody commented on me, my work, or even the fact that I was there. I picked up a breadstick, broke it in half, and forced myself to chew slowly. The crunch and salt gave me something to focus on while Celine soaked in another compliment. There's a saying I once heard. In every family, there's the golden child, and then there's the one they forget to photograph. Sitting next to the restroom door, ignored by everyone except the strangers brushing past me, I knew exactly which one I was. The waiter poured water into our glasses, and the conversation swelled again. Mom leaned toward Celine, her face glowing with pride. "Your campaign launch photos were all over social media. Honestly, you looked like you stepped out of a magazine." I cleared my throat softly and tried to join. "I finished my nursing certification last month, officially licensed now." The table went silent for a breath, but Celine swooped in with flawless timing. "That's wonderful," she said with a sweet smile, before pivoting back. "My manager said my work might land me the lead on the new client pitch. It could be huge for the agency." The relatives lit up, clapping, nodding, asking questions. Dad chuckled, raising his glass like a toast. My words dissolved into nothingness. I swallowed hard and pushed forward. "I've been working extra shifts at the hospital too. It's been busy." Celine cut in again, resting her chin on her hand with mock innocence. "Do you think it's because you always choose boyfriends who can't resist me? I mean, honestly, it's become a running joke." The table burst into laughter, uneasy, forced, but laughter nonetheless. My cheeks flushed hot, but I smiled faintly, refusing to give her the satisfaction of seeing me crumble. My insides twisted, though. This wasn't just dinner. This was every dinner, every gathering, every moment where Celine bent reality to make herself shine while I became the shadow. Dad tried to diffuse the tension with a weak joke about football, but nobody addressed the comment. Nobody defended me. I tapped the edge of my glass with one finger, holding back the words boiling in my throat. I stayed silent, not because I had nothing to say, but because I was learning, cataloging, filing away every insult Celine laid out like confetti. As the plates arrived, my thoughts drifted to the week before. I had carefully prepared an invitation for my best friend's wedding reception, writing both our names on the envelope, mine and Alex's, my boyfriend at the time. I left it on the kitchen counter, planning to give it to him after his shift. When I walked into the reception hall that night, I froze in place. Alex was already there, on Celine's arm. They stood together under the chandelier, smiling, her hand tucked into his like it had always belonged. Gasps spread around the room as whispers cut through the music. "Isn't that her sister's boyfriend?" My best friend, the bride, looked away quickly, her smile forced. I stood stiff in my dress, the room spinning. I ducked into the restroom, locking myself inside a stall, pressing both hands against my chest. Outside, laughter echoed, muffled but sharp. Later, Alex admitted sheepishly that Celine had intercepted the invitation. She told him I'd said she could take him instead, that I didn't care. His tone was casual, like he hadn't even questioned her. Back at Olive Garden, the restroom door smacked my elbow as another guest rushed in. I looked at Celine, glowing as she told some polished story, hair tossing just so, earrings glinting. The déjà vu was suffocating. Once again, I was shoved to the margins, replaced, invisible. The breadsticks had gone cold by the time dessert menus landed. I studied Celine's performance across the table. Every tilt of her head, every perfectly timed laugh, every admiring nod from relatives felt rehearsed. 7 years. That's how long this had gone on. Boyfriends stolen, events ruined, my place at the table chipped away. 1 betrayal could be an accident. 2, maybe bad luck. But year after year, I realized this wasn't chance. It was a deliberate game. I remembered a patient once telling me, family should be your soft place to fall. For me, family had always been the hard floor that left bruises. I folded my napkin slowly, pressing the corners together, forcing my breathing steady. Sitting in the restroom chair, I realized something had shifted. The sting wasn't quiet anymore. It had turned into an itch I couldn't ignore, a wound exposed to air. Maybe this was the last time I'd sit here silently. Maybe this humiliation had finally outlived its power. The dinner wound down, waiters clearing plates as Celine lifted her glass, commanding the room as always. "To family," she said brightly, her eyes locking on mine with a glint that made my skin prickle. I raised my glass too, but didn't drink. I held her gaze until she faltered just slightly, a crack only I noticed. The restroom door opened again, brushing my arm, and I almost laughed. Even a restroom door had more presence than I did, but not anymore. I slipped on my coat and stood tall. My mind was sharper than the steak knives that clattered onto plates. For years I had thought about how to survive her games. Tonight, for the first time, I thought about how to end them. And that night, I thought about what it would take to finally turn the table. Senior prom was supposed to be a milestone, the night where a girl like me finally got to step into the glow instead of living in the shadow. I had saved for months, working small shifts at the diner after school, tucking away enough money to buy a dress that felt special, even if it wasn't designer. It was pale blue, simple but elegant, the kind of dress that made me feel like maybe I belonged. I ironed it myself, careful with every seam, knowing it might wrinkle on the ride. Trevor, my boyfriend then, came to pick me up. He wasn't flashy, his tux looked rented and a little too big, but he carried himself with a nervous smile that gave me hope. "You look beautiful," he said softly, handing me a corsage wrapped in plastic. It wasn't extravagant, but it was thoughtful, and for once I felt like maybe this night would be mine. Dad pulled out the camera, trying to capture the moment, but every time he adjusted the angle, Mom called Celine over. "Stand next to your sister, honey. Let me get a picture of you both." Celine wasn't even going to prom. She had graduated, but she stood there in a sleek black dress, bought just for the night out she'd planned. Her lipstick perfect, her hair glossy, her presence drowned mine out like a spotlight next to a candle. Still, I held on to Trevor's arm, determined to claim the night. The drive felt like freedom. For once, it seemed the night might actually belong to me. Every girl remembers her prom night. Some remember the dance. I remember the betrayal. The gym was transformed with twinkling lights, balloons, and the faint smell of hairspray and cologne. Couples filled the dance floor, laughing, posing for selfies, the music pulsing through the speakers. Trevor and I found our rhythm, awkward but sweet, swaying side to side. For a brief moment, I allowed myself to imagine a normal memory, one unmarred by Celine's shadow. That illusion didn't last. Halfway through the night, Celine appeared. She wasn't invited, not by me, not by Trevor. She slipped past the chaperones, her confidence acting as her ticket. She smiled at me as though her presence were natural, like she had every right to be there. "Just thought I'd stop by," she said brightly, brushing past me and leaning toward Trevor. "You don't mind, do you?" I froze. Before I could respond, she was already dancing with him, circling him like a predator who knew exactly when the prey would give in. Trevor laughed nervously at first, but within minutes the gap closed. Her hand rested on his shoulder, her lips dangerously close to his ear. And then it happened. She kissed him, bold, deliberate, unapologetic. The worst part wasn't the kiss. It was the phone held high by a classmate, streaming it live on Facebook. Gasps filled the gym. Laughter followed, whispers cutting through the music. "Isn't that her sister's boyfriend?" Unbelievable. Teachers looked away, their faces stiff with discomfort, unwilling to intervene. Trevor didn't pull back. He let it happen, and Celine smiled into the camera like it was her coronation. My humiliation wasn't private. It was broadcast for the entire school, etched permanently online. Inside, I felt something tear, not just the bond between me and Trevor, but the dignity of that night. It wasn't about losing a boy. It was about losing the one memory that should have belonged to me alone. I left early, clutching my clutch bag like a lifeline. I told the chaperones I felt sick. Trevor didn't follow. He stayed behind, tangled in Celine's orbit, unwilling or unable to pull away. The ride home was unbearable. The driver said nothing, the silence broken only by the sound of my shallow breaths. When I got home, I slipped off my shoes, climbed the stairs, and shut the door to my room before anyone could ask questions. But Mom did knock later. I tried to explain, voice shaking, that Celine had stolen Trevor in front of everyone. Mom's response was quick, dismissive. "Boys will be boys. Don't let it bother you. Celine just has that effect on people." I stood there, stunned. Instead of outrage, instead of comfort, I was met with excuses. Dad said nothing at all, sitting in his chair watching TV like nothing had happened. That silence cut deeper than Mom's words. In that moment, I realized my pain wasn't just mine. It was invisible to the people who should have cared most. Sometimes silence in a family isn't peace. It's permission for cruelty. College brought new faces, new beginnings, and for a while, I thought I could outrun the pattern. But Celine always found a way to prove me wrong. She developed a new tactic, one she wielded with precision. Every time I dated someone, every time I dared to introduce a man to the family, she found her opening. At first, it was casual conversations, then accidental run-ins. Eventually, it became her signature move. The 2 a.m. message. My phone would buzz on the nightstand. I'd roll over, half asleep, and notice his screen light up. Her name always there, a flat tire, an emotional breakdown, a sudden crisis, always just enough to draw him out of bed and into her waiting arms. The first time, I brushed it off. Boys could be careless. The second time, I wondered if I was cursed. But by the third, the fourth, I knew it wasn't chance. Screens glowing in the dark became my trigger. Every 2 a.m., buzz meant another relationship slipping through my fingers. I bit my tongue, swallowing my anger. To fight her would be to admit she had power over me. And yet, each betrayal carved a deeper line inside me. Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. By the third or fourth time, I stopped blaming fate. I knew better. It wasn't about love anymore. It wasn't about me being unlucky. It was about Celine proving she could take anything I touched, because she could. That was her game. And for years, I played along by staying silent. Nights became endless. I'd lie awake, the glow of another phone screen flashing across the dark room. I watched boyfriends slip further away, pulled into Celine's orbit, just like Trevor had been. The pattern was clear, the humiliation constant. If I couldn't keep a man, I whispered to myself one night, staring at the ceiling, maybe I could at least keep my dignity. But even as I said it, I knew I wasn't content with surviving. Something else stirred under the hurt. I wasn't planning revenge, not yet, but the seed had been planted. And it was at Thanksgiving, years later, when my mother's words cut sharper than my sister's games. The smell of roasted turkey and pumpkin pie filled the house before I even stepped inside. My parents' home in Aurora was crowded with voices and laughter, the football game humming low from the living room where uncles gathered with beers in hand. I walked through the door holding a small pumpkin pie I had baked that morning. It wasn't perfect, edges a little uneven, crust a bit too brown, but I wanted to contribute something meaningful. I thought, maybe foolishly, that this Thanksgiving could be different, that for once I might not feel like the afterthought. I set the pie on the counter, unnoticed, as relatives leaned towards Celine, who had arrived fashionably late, wearing a dress far too elegant for a family meal. She glided into the room like she was walking a runway, her coat draped over her arm, her perfume trailing behind her. All eyes turned. Compliments flowed easily. "Celine, you look incredible," someone said. "Always so polished," another added. I stood off to the side, smoothing my sweater, waiting for someone to glance at me, but my pie sat on the counter untouched, and I might as well have been invisible. I swallowed my disappointment, sat at the table, and reminded myself, in families like mine, silence doesn't heal wounds, it just hides them under gravy. A quote I once read echoed in my head. Family is supposed to be your safe haven. Often, it's the place where you find the deepest cuts. Dinner began with chatter and clinking silverware. I passed plates of stuffing, mashed potatoes and rolls, trying to blend into the rhythm. For a few minutes, I managed to relax, but then a cousin, smirking as he sipped his drink, looked straight at me. "Whatever happened to Derek?" The question hit like a stone thrown into still water, sending ripples through my chest. Derek, my boyfriend years ago, the one I thought might be the one I could trust. The name pulled me backward, away from the turkey and warm rolls, into a memory I had tried to bury. It was my 24th birthday. I had spent weeks planning a dinner at Applebee's, calling ahead for reservations, decorating the table with small balloons and a cake. Derek sat next to me, laughing, holding my hand. For a short while, I felt celebrated, special. Then Celine arrived. She wasn't invited, yet she swept in as if the table had been set for her. Before I knew it, she was laughing beside Derek, whispering something into his ear. And then she kissed him, right there, in front of everyone. The restaurant went quiet, then filled with awkward chuckles and the click of phones. My friends glanced at me, some embarrassed, some too curious to look away. I felt like my skin was on fire. Later that night, Celine posted a picture on Facebook with the caption, "Sorry, not sorry." Even years later, sitting at Thanksgiving dinner, the humiliation sat across from me like an uninvited guest. I forced a smile, brushed off my cousin's question with a vague, "We didn't work out," and took another sip of water, though the taste had gone bitter. As the meal continued, Mom moved around the table with the gravy boat in hand. She leaned close while pouring it over my plate, her voice low but sharp enough to slice. "You need to stop bringing men around Celine. She can't help herself." The words pierced deeper than the carving knife resting by the turkey. I froze, fork halfway to my mouth, unsure if I'd heard correctly. But Mom's eyes were firm, her hand steady as she stirred the gravy. It wasn't Celine being blamed. It was me. According to Mom, I was the one tempting Celine, setting her up to fail, dragging men into the orbit she couldn't resist. Inside, my thoughts screamed, it wasn't that Celine couldn't help herself. It was that no one ever asked her to stop. A dad sat at the head of the table, silent, chewing methodically, eyes fixed on his plate. A cousin across from me smirked, clearly having caught enough of the whisper. The betrayal wasn't just Mom's words, it was the silence of everyone else. No one stood up for me. This wasn't just rejection, it was abandonment by the very person who should have defended me. Conversation carried on as though nothing had happened. Celine launched into stories about her latest work project, her travels, the new people she had met. Relatives leaned in, hanging on her every word, while I sat motionless, staring at my plate. Every so often, Mom's eyes cut toward me like warnings. Don't disrupt. Don't make a scene. Don't ruin Celine's shine. I gripped my fork tighter, imagining what it would feel like to stand, slam it onto the table, and call them all out, to say out loud the things I'd been choking on for years. But the words stayed lodged in my throat. In America, I thought, holidays are supposed to bring families together. In mine, they only sharpen the knives. I let the conversation flow around me, observing, listening, learning. My silence wasn't weakness anymore. It was calculation, because in that moment, I realized I could weaponize it. As the evening wound down, Celine leaned back in her chair, wineglass in hand. She caught my eye and winked, a smug little gesture that said, "I dare you to fight me." I looked down at my plate, empty, crumbs where the pumpkin pie once sat. The pie I had brought was gone, consumed without comment, like me, swallowed whole and forgotten. The thought pressed into me like a stone. I wasn't just losing men, I was losing my place at this table. But as Celine's smirk widened, something inside me shifted. I didn't need to fight her tonight. I didn't need to defend myself in front of a family too blind to see. One day, she would discover that the sister who stayed quiet was also the sister who had learned how to plan. For nearly 2 years, I believed I had finally escaped the endless cycle Celine created. Connor wasn't like the others. He was steady, patient, and kind in ways that made me think the world hadn't completely turned against me. We met through a mutual friend, and unlike my past relationships, I kept this one quiet for as long as I could. No introductions at family dinners, no photographs posted online, no breadcrumbs for Celine to follow. Life with Connor had a rhythm that felt new to me. Morning coffee brewed before I woke, his note on the counter. Good luck on your shift today. Evenings waiting in his apartment, dinner simmering on the stove when I returned exhausted from 12 hours at the hospital. On weekends, we walked through open houses, talking about neighborhoods, mortgages, and whether the backyard would be big enough for a dog. I dared to believe in permanence. There's a phrase I once read by Emily Dickinson: "Hope is the thing with feathers." And in Connor, I thought I had found feathers strong enough to keep me off the ground. But in my family, every wing eventually gets clipped. Deep down, I should have known perfection never lasts. It was a Tuesday evening when I drove straight from the hospital to Connor's apartment. I carried a small bag of groceries, ingredients for lasagna, his favorite. I let myself in with my key, expecting to hear music, maybe the sound of him clattering pans. Instead, I heard laughter. A woman's laughter. Familiar. The sound cut off quickly when the door clicked shut behind me. My chest tightened. I walked through the living room, groceries sliding from my fingers onto the counter. There they were. Celine and Connor. Tangled in his sheets. Half-dressed, not even startled enough to scramble apart. My heart didn't stop. It pounded so hard I thought it would break through my ribs. Celine sat up first, brushing her hair back like she'd merely been caught lounging. She smirked, that same smirk I had seen since childhood when she took something of mine. "Honestly," she said with sickly sweetness, "I did you a favor. He's barely worth the time." Connor leaned back against the pillows, completely unashamed, his tone casual, dismissive. "Your sister's too hot not to try. You get it, right?" The words stunned me silent. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. My body shook, but my face hardened. Rage built under my skin like static, invisible but searing. It wasn't about Connor. I could see that clearly now. It was about Celine watching my reaction, savoring the wreckage. There's a saying people use often. In America, betrayal stings worst when it comes from your own blood. I understood it with my whole being in that moment. I walked out quietly. No dramatic exit, no slammed doors, just silence. My hands trembled as I gripped the steering wheel, nearly swerving into another lane, my breath ragged and shallow. I almost ran a red light before jerking the car to a stop. The city lights blurred as I blinked furiously, but no tears came. I wasn't mourning Connor. I was mourning the last bit of hope I had guarded for myself. Celine's cruelty was never about attraction or chance. It was about control, about reminding me she could take whatever I tried to build, simply because I had dared to build it. Dad's words floated back from years ago. Some lessons only sink in when you let people fall. Sitting at that red light, my grip on the wheel cutting into my palms, I made a vow. Silence would no longer mean surrender. It would mean strategy. Weeks later, I attended my college reunion at a Denver bar. The evening started lighthearted, with familiar faces greeting me warmly, hugs exchanged, updates shared. For a short while, I felt normal, like I wasn't defined by Celine's shadow. But normal never lasted. At the bar, a former classmate leaned close with a smirk. "So, did your sister take your boyfriend again?" The words rippled across the group, igniting laughter. It wasn't cruel from them. It was casual, careless, but it still burned. Even friends I once trusted chuckled. They weren't laughing at Connor. They were laughing at me, at my history, my reputation, the pattern Celine had created and the world had accepted as truth. Celine wasn't even in the room, yet she dominated it. My humiliation had traveled further than I ever walked. She didn't just take men. She had taken my name, reshaped it into a punchline. I forced a small smile, lifted my glass, and replied smoothly, "Not everyone's soul is for sale." The group laughed again, but this time it was uneasy, and for once, I was the one who controlled the silence that followed. Inside, though, fire roared. If humiliation could spread like wildfire, maybe revenge could too. I left the reunion early, stepping into the cool night air, the city lights flickering above. My heels clicked against the sidewalk, steady and sharp. I realized then that Celine hadn't just stolen boyfriends, she had stolen my voice. For years, she had scripted the story everyone believed about me. But people forget, silence has an echo. And if you hold it long enough, that echo can shake the walls louder than words ever could. The next Thanksgiving, my mother handed Celine the knife, but I was the one already sharpening mine. It had been a year since Connor, since the night I walked out of his apartment with my world caving in, but my silence sharper than any words. Thanksgiving arrived again, and as much as I dreaded sitting at that familiar table, I still carried a casserole dish warm from the oven. I had baked it myself that morning, layering potatoes, cheese, and herbs, trying to prove to myself I still belonged at that table, even if my place had always been near the edges. When I walked in, voices carried from the dining room, laughter ringing loud. Celine was already there this time, no late arrival for dramatic effect. She stood in the kitchen, coat off, hair gleaming, as relatives surrounded her like moths to a flame. Compliments showered her the moment she stepped through the threshold. "You're glowing, Celine." Always so radiant. I set my casserole down quietly, barely a glance my way. No one asked what I had brought or how long I'd worked on it. I pressed my lips into a thin smile and carried myself to the dining table, taking in the chatter, the faint roar of the football game from the living room, the smell of turkey wafting through every corner. There was warmth in the air, but none of it belonged to me. I thought of a saying I once read: "Nothing exposes a family's fractures like the holidays." Sitting there, invisible again, I knew those cracks had widened into canyons. Dinner moved along in its usual rhythm. Platters passed, jokes exchanged, Celine dazzling the room with stories of her busy life. And then, as glasses were filled with wine, Mom stood, holding hers high. "I'd like to make a toast," she announced, her smile wide, her eyes shining with pride. "To Celine, who is on the brink of an exciting new chapter, a future engagement, a bright career, a life we can all be proud of." The table erupted in cheers, glasses clinking together. Everyone leaned in to look at Celine, who soaked in every ounce of admiration. And my glass sat untouched in front of me. Then came the knife, literally. Someone slid it toward me to cut the pie, a silent cue that my role was to serve, not to be celebrated. My casserole sat untouched at the end of the table, while Celine's imaginary engagement became the star of the evening. Inside, something hardened. Every cheer for her felt like another nail sealing the box I was forced into. My silence stretched across the table, and Dad's eyes flickered toward me for a moment, heavy with recognition. He said nothing, but the weight of his glance told me he saw the wound. I stopped smiling. For the first time, I let the mask slip. Later that evening, after plates were cleared and conversations drifted, I stepped out onto the porch for air. The chill cut through my sweater, but it felt cleaner than the stifling room inside. That's when I heard the footsteps, Indira. He had come outside too, his presence unsettling in a way I couldn't quite name yet. He leaned casually against the railing, his breath fogging in the cold. "You don't look like you're enjoying yourself," he said smoothly. I crossed my arms. "Family dinners aren't exactly my stage." He chuckled, tilting his head. "If you don't want me with Celine, I could choose you instead." I froze, not because I wanted him, but because of the audacity. His confidence was sharp, predatory. "You think this is a game?" I asked, my voice low. "Everything's a game when the prize is Celine," he replied, eyes gleaming. In that moment, I understood. He wasn't just arrogant, he was dangerous. But a thought sparked in me, almost unbidden. Sometimes the only way to beat a predator is to point him toward bigger prey. I didn't answer. I didn't have to. The seed was planted. When I walked back into the dining room, the scene hadn't changed. Celine still commanded the room, laughing with relatives who leaned in as if her words were gospel. Mom glowed at her side, basking in the reflected shine. My father sat quieter, listening, observing, but not stepping in. I sat back down, posture straighter, eyes sharper. I didn't argue, didn't confront. I no longer felt the urge to fight for scraps of recognition. My silence had shifted, no longer the silence of defeat, but the silence of calculation. Celine glanced at me briefly, her smirk daring me to interrupt. I didn't give her that satisfaction. Instead, I picked up my fork, set it down, and let the moment pass. I realized then that silence wasn't surrender. It was a blade sharper than any toast, stronger than any cheer. It could cut deeper if wielded correctly. As the night ended, relatives wrapped Celine in hugs, their goodbyes dripping with praise. "So proud of you," they said. "Can't wait for the big news." When they glanced at me, it was perfunctory. A pat on the shoulder, a half smile, no questions asked. My casserole dish was handed back to me, half full. I drove home gripping the steering wheel, headlights carving through the night, but I wasn't broken anymore. I was resolved. The highway stretched ahead, long and dark, but my thoughts burned brighter than the streetlights. Celine may have stolen boyfriends, humiliated me at tables and parties, turned my life into a series of humiliations. But there was one thing she didn't have: clarity. That Thanksgiving, while she basked in the spotlight, I made a decision. I would build a fire no one could ignore, one that would outshine her stage lights, one that would finally expose who she really was. After that Thanksgiving toast, something inside me hardened into steel. Silence had served me for years, but I finally understood it couldn't be the end. It had to be the beginning. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I realized survival was no longer enough. If I wanted my life back, if I wanted my dignity restored, I had to stop reacting and start planning. The next weeks were quiet ones, but not the kind Celine had grown used to from me. My nights were spent with the glow of my laptop in a darkened apartment, stacks of notes beside me. I sifted through old social media posts, public court documents, whispers from acquaintances. I typed names into search engines, cross-referenced faces with places. There were men Celine had left in her wake, broken engagements, sudden financial collapses, reputations tarnished. Every line of text felt like a piece of a puzzle I had ignored for too long. In America, I thought, scrolling through another set of records, everything leaves a trace if you're patient enough to look. Then I found her. A woman named Cressida. She had once been with Indira, the same charming man who had made that audacious offer on my parents' porch. Her testimony was buried in legal filings, but it was there in black and white. Lost savings, destroyed credit, accusations of fraud. Reading her words, my breath caught. The pain was so vivid, I could almost hear her voice. I knew in that moment I had found an ally. We met at a coffee shop downtown, one of those busy places where the hum of conversation masked anything serious. She sat across from me, her posture wary but her eyes sharp. She was older than me, maybe mid-30s, with lines of exhaustion etched into her face. "You're Leora," she said, more statement than question. "Yes," I answered. "I think we have more in common than either of us would like." Her hands wrapped around her cup, knuckles pale. "He charms fast, but he poisons faster. That's how Indira works." I nodded slowly, and Celine can't resist poison dressed as perfection. Her laugh was bitter, short. "He drained me dry, my savings, my credit, everything gone. And when I tried to walk away, he threatened me, made me feel like I was the crazy one." I listened, feeling the familiar weight of betrayal in her words. Different circumstances, same scars. "I'm sorry," I said quietly. "But maybe what destroyed you could destroy her too." Her gaze sharpened. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying," I leaned in, lowering my voice, "that I can point Celine straight at him, and I'll make sure she doesn't see the trap until it's too late." For a long moment, she stared at me, searching my face for any sign of hesitation. Then she nodded slowly. "They say revenge is a dish best served cold. But sometimes," she said, her voice steady, "it's best served documented, in legal records. It wasn't a spoken contract, but it was one all the same. She gave me pieces of her story, the warnings I needed, and I carried them like a map. Back home, I spread papers across my table like a general planning a battle. I was no longer the woman who flinched at Celine's smirk. I was the one crafting her downfall. For 7 years, she wrote the script, I whispered to myself. Tonight, I hold the pen. Every move had to be deliberate. Celine's weakness was vanity, her hunger to outshine me no matter the cost. All I had to do was make the bait irresistible. I printed old court documents, the paper warm in my hands. Each page felt like sharpening a knife in silence, preparing for the cut. For a fleeting moment, guilt pricked me. Cressida's warning that Indira ruined lives, that his poison lingered. But I pushed it down. Celine had taught me humiliation. Now I would teach her consequence. The chance came on a Sunday evening. My parents hosted a casual dinner. Nothing special, pot roast, salad, laughter echoing in the familiar dining room. I arrived with Indira at my side, my arm linked with his like a smitten girlfriend. Dad shook his hand, cracking a joke. Strong grip. Good to see someone treating my daughter right. Mom eyed him approvingly. Attentive, isn't he? She looked at me, finally acknowledging me, if only because of the man beside me. Celine sat across the table, silent at first, her smile tight. I could feel her eyes on us, sharp, calculating. I laughed louder than usual, brushed Indira's arm as if by accident, let him lean close. It was theater, every gesture designed to trigger Celine's instincts. And sure enough, she began to lean forward, her gaze lingering on him longer than on her plate. At one point, I excused myself to the restroom. As I walked back through the hallway, I caught sight of them in the reflection of the glass cabinet. Celine's hand touched his arm lightly, her laugh too loud, too forced. My pulse quickened, not with jealousy, but with satisfaction. The trap was closing, and she was stepping into it of her own free will. When dinner ended, Indira collected Celine's number discreetly, just as I had predicted. The others didn't notice or pretended not to. I said my goodbyes, drove home alone. The night air was colder than I expected, but inside me a fire burned steady, sharp, unyielding. Everyone thought I had lost another man. Only I knew the truth. I had just set the bait. I found out about Celine's engagement the way most people find out about a stranger's good news, through Instagram. I woke up one morning, scrolled through my feed with half-open eyes, and there it was. Celine's hand stretched out against a rooftop skyline, a diamond glittering on her finger. The caption read, #forever blessed. The photos weren't just pictures of her. They were filled with family members, relatives smiling wide, glasses raised high in celebration. My mother stood beside her, glowing with pride, and my father looked, at least in the frozen still of the photo, content. Everyone was there. Everyone except me. The exclusion burned hotter than the ring itself. This wasn't an oversight. This was a message. Even in her happiest moment, she needed me erased. I scrolled through the comments. So proud of you, Celine. You've always been the gem of this family. Not a single mention of me. My phone felt heavy in my hands, and I could almost hear Celine's voice behind every word. You don't belong here. There's an American saying that rattled in my head as I stared at her filtered smile. Family secrets don't stay secrets anymore. They're posted, filtered, and hashtagged. Weeks later, I attended a casual family dinner, though I wasn't sure why I bothered. The air inside was thick with talk of the engagement. Every conversation circled back to the rooftop party I had not been invited to. That rooftop view was amazing, my cousin said, looking at me with a half smirk. Too bad you missed it. I smiled thinly, stabbing at the potatoes on my plate. Yes, too bad. Mom avoided my gaze, her voice bright as she praised Celine's fiancé. Such a fine man. Successful, charming, and family-oriented. Celine really chose well. Celine leaned back in her chair, her wine glass glinting in the light. She tilted her head, smirk tugging at her lips. You were busy, right? That's why you couldn't make it? The question hung in the air, barbed and deliberate. I forced a chuckle, though inside my stomach twisted. I didn't answer her directly. I didn't give her that satisfaction. My inner response wasn't humiliation this time. It was fuel. Exclusion wasn't silence anymore. It was her handwriting on my revenge note. Not long after, I found myself standing in a bridal boutique in Cherry Creek. Celine had asked me to come, presenting it as an olive branch. "You're my sister," she said sweetly. "I want you there when I choose the dress." For once, I agreed. I wanted to see her up close, to measure the sharpness of her games, to learn her moves. The boutique smelled of roses and satin. Racks of gowns glimmered under soft lighting. Brides twirled in front of mirrors, mothers clapping with joy. Celine floated through the room like royalty, attendants buzzing around her. Then one of the staff approached me with a dress bag. "This one's in your size," she said, handing it over with a polite smile that didn't reach her eyes. I unzipped it in the dressing room, my chest tightening. It was several sizes too big, deliberately so. When I stepped out, fabric pooling at my feet, Celine clasped her hands together and laughed. "Oh, maybe they thought you gained weight," she teased, voice sweet enough to cut. Other shoppers glanced our way. Some looked away quickly, embarrassed for me. Others smirked, amused. The sting was sharp, but I swallowed it, refusing to let the hurt show. Humiliation is her language, I thought, staring at myself in the mirror. But silence will be mine. In America, I told myself as I stepped out of the gown, we clap when brides twirl. But I learned to keep my hands still and my eyes sharp. Driving home that evening, the laughter from the boutique replayed in my head. Every smirk, every pointed glance, every barb Celine had delivered. But instead of collapsing under it, I catalogued it. Who laughed? Who stayed quiet? How Celine smirked when she thought she had won. Every insult was a receipt, and receipts can be cashed in later. The two big dress bags sat on the seat beside me, like an unwanted reminder of the game she had played. Yet to me, it was evidence. A symbol of the line she had crossed. I whispered into the empty car, words meant only for myself. She can have the dress, but I'll own the stage. At home, I hung the oversized dress in my closet. It dangled there, a grotesque shape against the other clothes, not as shame, but as a reminder. Each time I passed it, I felt less like a victim and more like someone taking careful notes. Celine thought she had written me out of her engagement story. What she didn't understand was that the sister she mocked for being too small was the same sister who could make her world collapse. The messages started pouring in before the sun rose. My phone buzzed on the nightstand, first one vibration, then another, then a flood that wouldn't stop. I rubbed my eyes, picked it up, and froze. There it was, a private clip of me. A moment I had shared with someone I thought I could trust, now ripped from its safe place and scattered across the internet like shards of glass. It wasn't just my family who could humiliate me anymore. This was public. This was permanent. By the time I opened my social media apps, the clip was everywhere. Comments stacked under it like vultures pecking at the same carcass. Some wrote cruel jokes. Others offered pity disguised as kindness. Wow, didn't see that coming. She should have known better. Poor thing. But the worst part wasn't the strangers. It was the familiar names. Cousins, old classmates, people who never spoke to me suddenly found their voices in my downfall. In America, shame travels faster than truth. And once it's online, it never dies. My anger wasn't only at Celine, though I had no doubt she had a hand in this. It was at myself, too, for giving her the access she needed, for letting my guard down just long enough for her to strike. I could have hidden. I could have feigned illness, stayed away, refused to show my face, but that wasn't an option anymore. Family expected me at the rehearsal dinner, and I wasn't about to give Celine the satisfaction of watching me retreat. So I went. The hotel ballroom glowed with chandeliers, polished marble floors, and the faint scent of roses. Every table was draped in ivory cloth, glasses arranged with precision. It was everything Celine had always wanted, an audience for her perfect image. As I walked in, conversations quieted just slightly. Relatives glanced at me, some pitying, some smirking, all whispering behind napkins. I felt their eyes crawling over me, the story of the leaked clip hanging in the air like smoke no one dared acknowledge. I kept my chin high. If they were waiting to see me break, they'd wait a long time. The dinner began, wine poured, plates set. Toasts rose one by one, relatives praising Celine, congratulating her on her upcoming marriage, her beauty, her grace. I listened, each word another stone pressing down on my chest. Then, during one lull in the chatter, Celine spoke. She stood, glass in hand, her smile wide. "Maybe," she said, her voice carrying across the ballroom, "we shouldn't hand the mic to my sister this time. God knows what might end up online again." Laughter broke around the room. Not loud, not cruel, but enough. Enough to make my skin burn. She had ensured I was excluded, not just from the celebration, but from dignity itself. In one sentence, she painted me as untrustworthy, dangerous, unworthy of the family name. I sat still, forcing calm over the fury storming inside me. My hands rested in my lap, my back straight. On the outside, I was composed. Inside, I was on fire. Celine had humiliated me in private my whole life. Tonight, she made me the entertainment. There's nothing more American than a wedding, and nothing more cruel than being erased from it. I didn't argue, I didn't storm out or slam a door. I sat through the laughter, each second a test of endurance. But as the minutes ticked by, I saw something Celine didn't intend. My silence unsettled her. She wanted a reaction. My tears, my rage, my retreat. Instead, she found only stillness, a wall she couldn't crack. I noted every smirk, every eye roll, every relative who laughed too easily. Each detail became a record in my mind, evidence I would cash in later. They thought this was the final humiliation. What they didn't know was that it would be the last time Celine laughed at my expense. I sat, smiling faintly, sipping water as though nothing had touched me. But inside, the decision was carved in stone. This wasn't weakness anymore. This was leverage. As the dinner wound down, Celine clinked her glass again, basking in the spotlight she believed belonged to her. She thought she had won. I stepped outside into the Denver night, the air sharp and cold against my cheeks. My heart raced, but my steps were steady. She thought tonight was the peak of her power. Tomorrow, she'd learn it was the start of her fall. And by the time the wedding began, Celine wasn't the one walking tall anymore. The ballroom gleamed like a dream, every inch drenched in white roses and glittering crystal chandeliers. Guests filled the air with chatter, their voices bouncing off polished marble, the hum of a string quartet weaving beneath it. Celine stood at the center, draped in her designer gown, lace spilling down like she was carved from ivory. Her veil shimmered under the lights, and every guest leaned toward her as if she were a queen about to be crowned. Family whispered around me, their words warm with admiration. "She looks radiant. Like a queen. This is her moment." I sat quietly at the edge, a place I had grown used to, my dress simple but sharp, blending into the background. My eyes stayed fixed on Celine, though not in awe. Weddings in America aren't just about love. They're about image, spectacle, the illusion of perfection. And tonight, her image would collapse. The tension in the air was tangible, though no one but me seemed to sense it. I could feel the thread stretching, too tight, about to snap. The ceremony began, soft vows drifting through the room. Celine smiled at Indira, her hand gripping the bouquet, her lips painted the perfect shade of red. But then I saw it, the flicker in her expression. A sway. Her smile faltered. Guests shifted, murmurs rising. Celine gripped the podium, knuckles whitening against the wood. Her knees buckled. And then, in front of everyone, she crumbled to the floor, her white gown pooling around her like spilt milk. Gasps tore through the crowd. "Is she fainting?" someone shouted. "Call 911!" another cried. Chairs scraped, footsteps rushed. Some guests leaned forward, panic written across their faces, while others froze, mouths open, horror spilling across the ballroom. I stayed seated, my hands folded in my lap, my face calm. My silence was deliberate. Indira knelt beside her, his hands hovering without urgency. His face was too composed, his eyes calculating, scanning the room rather than her. He pressed his hand against her shoulder, feigning concern, but I caught it, the stillness in his expression. He wasn't surprised. I thought, the queen has fallen and the kingdom is finally seeing her without her crown. Nothing stains white faster than the truth. Later, when the chaos had calmed and paramedics hovered near, the whispers spread like wildfire through the reception. Was it the champagne? Stress, maybe? Or something worse? I stood near the bar, listening, not speaking. That's when Malus appeared. My heart jolted at the sight of him. An ex-boyfriend, one Celine had taken from me years ago. He looked older now, wearier, but his eyes carried something I hadn't seen before. Guilt. He stepped close, voice low. She used me, just like she used everyone else. I narrowed my gaze. Why say this now? Because I should have told you sooner, he said, shame thick in his tone. She manipulated me, pushed me into things I regret, made me feel small, worthless. I let her convince me it was my fault, but it wasn't. It never was. I stared at him, my chest tight with the weight of years gone. The truth always comes late, but at least it comes. Our words weren't private for long. The people around us caught fragments, leaning in, whispering, spreading the confession. Each sentence cracked Celine's perfect facade further. For once, the cracks were visible to everyone, not just me. The room shifted, admiration soured into suspicion. Heads turned toward Celine, their smiles faltering. She wasn't the flawless bride anymore. She was a woman unraveling in front of her own audience. Paramedics steadied her, lifting her carefully. Her veil slipped, hair sticking damply to her face. Makeup streaked down her cheeks, the designer gown torn at the hem. The room, once filled with applause and admiration, now buzzed with uneasy whispers. Mom wept loudly, clutching at relatives' hands, her words broken between sobs. It's just stress. She's under so much pressure. Dad stood still, arms crossed, face carved into stone. He didn't move toward her. He didn't defend me either, but his silence this time felt different, resigned, almost detached. I watched quietly, unmoved. This wasn't the end of Celine's reign, but it was the beginning of her exposure. I thought, weddings are supposed to be new beginnings. For my sister, this was the start of her ending. As Celine was wheeled toward the exit, the crowd parted. Some guests recoiled, horrified. Others whispered, satisfaction gleaming in their voices. The perfect image she had curated for years had shattered in one public collapse. I stood still, my eyes steady on her. The collapse wasn't mine anymore. It was hers. And the next day, her downfall wouldn't just be whispered. It would be broadcast. The ballroom no longer smelled of roses. It smelled of fear. Even after Celine's collapse in her white gown, she had insisted the reception go on. Guests tried to follow along, sipping champagne and nibbling at overpriced hors d'oeuvres, but their voices never lifted above a murmur. Laughter felt borrowed, and every smile seemed to fray at the edges. I sat at a round table near the back, a vantage point that let me see everything, the guests exchanging whispers, the way my mother's eyes tracked Celine with frantic devotion, the way my father kept his silence, nursing a glass of bourbon as if it might tell him what to say. Some families patch cracks with shared stories and gentle teasing. Mine tried to plaster lies over a collapsing wall. Every toast, every laugh was another layer of denial, but the cracks kept spreading. I swirled the champagne in my flute, but didn't drink. I wasn't waiting for comfort. I was waiting for the real moment, the one Celine wouldn't see coming. The speeches began. One cousin praised Celine's grace under pressure. Another uncle rambled about marriage as a fortress built on trust. Each word struck me as bitterly ironic. Then the ballroom projector flickered. At first, people assumed it was the slideshow, a curated gallery of Celine and her fiancé posing at beaches and vineyards. But the sound was wrong. It wasn't romantic music. It was Celine's laugh. The screen snapped to life. There she was, in casual clothes, wine glass in hand, lounging on a sofa. Her words carried through the speakers, clear and cutting. I can take any man she dates. It's easy. She hands them over without even realizing. A gasp tore through the room. Forks clinked against plates. Guests leaned forward in disbelief. Did she really say that? A woman whispered near the front. All these years, my aunt muttered, her hand over her chest. It wasn't just accidents. Celine jumped from her chair, red with fury. This is out of context. Someone's manipulating this. It's a joke. But no one laughed. Her fiancé's hand slipped from hers. The best man shifted uncomfortably. Friends who once orbited her like moths now pulled back. I sat perfectly still, letting the projector's glow wash over me. For once, I wasn't the one caught in the light. She had built her kingdom on humiliation, and tonight the walls crumbled with her own words. The bigger the stage, the harder the fall. The chaos unfurled quickly. Some guests stood, muttering excuses about early mornings. Others clustered in corners, gossip spreading faster than champagne refills. Her fiancé turned to her, voice low but audible. Were you serious? No, Celine stammered. You know me, I joke. People record everything now, twist it. I was just exaggerating. Mom rushed in, frantic, tissue pressed to her lips. She's misunderstood. Celine always jokes like this. It's just her humor. Dad muttered into his glass, his voice flat. Not jokes anymore. That broke something. Guests avoided Celine as though scandal clung to her dress. Conversations faltered, and laughter died altogether. I remained quiet, the silence a crown no one could steal from me. She thought exposure would destroy me, but light destroys shadows. And tonight, the light wasn't mine to carry. Within days, the whispers hardened into headlines. Denver buzzed not with tales of champagne fountains or grand receptions, but with Celine's name tied to fraud investigations. The news anchors spoke of her fiancé's financial ties to Indira. More importantly, they spoke of Cressida, the woman who had once sat across from me in a Denver cafe, nursing her wounds with bitter coffee. Cressida testified. Her voice didn't tremble as she detailed how Indira bled her savings dry and how Celine had signed documents to help. Court papers surfaced like nails hammered into a coffin, Celine's signature on fraudulent transfers, her initials next to promises of secure investments. I read every page. The weight of the documents in my hands felt heavier than any insult I'd ever carried. Revenge didn't just live in family whispers. It lived in notarized evidence, stamped and undeniable. In America, truth doesn't just show up in gossip. It shows up in evidence. And Celine's name was branded on every page. The courthouse was a theater of judgment. Reporters shouted from behind barricades, cameras flashing as Celine walked up the steps in a navy suit, her diamond ring conspicuously absent. Inside, the air was taut with anticipation. Indira sat slouched, avoiding her eyes. Mom clutched her Bible, whispering prayers too quiet for anyone but herself. Dad sat with his arms crossed, the weight of his silence heavier than any testimony. I passed them in the hallway, documents tucked under my arm. My heels clicked against marble, sharp and steady. I didn't smirk. I didn't gloat. I simply existed, unbroken, as Celine unraveled before the world. Reporters pressed forward outside. Did you conspire with Indira? Was this about jealousy? About your sister? Celine lowered her head. For the first time, I saw not just cracks in her crown, but shards falling to the ground. For 7 years, she had stolen my voice. Tonight, her own voice condemned her. I left the courthouse into the sharp Denver wind, the papers rustling against my side. The sky above was a pale blue, clouds cutting across it like scars. I paused at the steps, staring down at the crowd, half curious onlookers, half wolves hungry for the next headline. My reflection caught faintly in the glass doors behind me. A woman no longer erased, no longer silenced. What happens to a family when its crown jewel turns to glass and shatters? The question trailed me as I walked into the cold, the echo of my heels marking the end of one story and the jagged beginning of another. When I pulled up in front of my parents' house that evening, the porch light glowed faintly, the same bulb that had always been there since my childhood. But the air felt different, thicker, heavier, as though the whole house had absorbed the fallout from Celine's wedding disaster. Inside, there was no music, no laughter, not even the clatter of dishes I used to associate with Sunday dinners, just whispers, hushed and clipped, as if the walls themselves were judging every word spoken too loud. Mom greeted me at the door, her eyes red and swollen, cheeks blotched from crying. She forced a weak smile but couldn't hold my gaze. Dad stayed seated in the living room, staring at the muted TV, pretending to watch the football game. Around the table, relatives tried to act normal, commenting on the roast, asking about the weather, as if small talk could paper over the chasm widening between us. Every fork scrape against china was louder than words. Sometimes silence is heavier than shouting. It's the weight of everything unspoken pressing down on a family. After the storm, families don't rebuild together. They choose which ruins to stand beside. Dinner began, stiff and awkward. I passed the potatoes, nodded politely, answered questions with one-word replies. Then, halfway through the meal, Mom's composure cracked. Her fork clattered against her plate, and tears spilled down her cheeks. She was under so much stress, Mom choked, dabbing her eyes with her napkin. Her voice trembled, carrying accusation without saying it outright. You didn't have to push so hard, Leora. The table went quiet. Knives froze mid-air. I set my fork down deliberately. I didn't push her, Mom. Her own choices did. Her lips trembled, and she shook her head. You don't understand. She's fragile. Always has been. Fragile? My voice rose just enough to make the room tense. She's been tearing people apart for years, and no one said a word. Fragile doesn't destroy reputations. Fragile doesn't manipulate lives. Fragile doesn't... Mom slammed her hand on the table, startling everyone. Enough! The silence that followed was suffocating. Relatives exchanged nervous glances, avoiding sides, eyes darting between us like spectators at a match they didn't want to admit they were watching. Her tears weren't for justice. They weren't for the truth. They were for image, the family name, the daughter who embarrassed us all by collapsing in her perfect gown on her perfect day. In America, reputation is sometimes worth more than truth. And tonight, that truth sat like a stone in my chest. Later, Dad asked me to step into the study. The room smelled faintly of old leather and tobacco, though he hadn't smoked in years. He stood by the desk, holding an envelope yellowed with age. His eyes, tired and lined, avoided mine as he extended it. I unfolded the letter carefully. The handwriting was his, rough and steady. You are stronger than you believe. Don't let this family define the size of your life. My throat tightened. You wrote this? When? Years ago, he said, his voice low. I never gave it to you. I thought my silence was strength. I see now. It was cowardice. I met his eyes. Then why didn't you defend me? All those years, sitting quiet while Celine mocked me, while Mom excused her? He swallowed hard. Because I thought she'd grow out of it, because I thought you didn't need me to fight for you. But I was wrong. You were always the one holding this family steady, Leora. And I never told you. The words landed heavier than any accusation ever had. They weren't an apology, not really, but they were an anchor, something to cling to in the storm. When we returned to the dining room, the cracks had widened. An uncle muttered, She brought this on herself. A cousin countered, Celine's still family. We should protect her. Mom's voice rose, sharp as glass. Protect her? She's being torn apart in public, and you sit there blaming her? Dad slammed his hand on the table this time. She's not a child anymore, Vera. She made her choices. Let her face them. Mom turned on him, eyes blazing with fury I'd only ever seen directed at me. You never stood up for her. Not once. Maybe if you had, none of this would have happened. The room erupted. Voices overlapped, some defending Celine, some condemning her. Plates rattled, chairs scraped, tension rising like a fire no one could put out. I sat in silence, watching. For years, I was the fracture, the weak link, the sister who couldn't hold her own. But tonight, the cracks spread to everyone else. Families don't break in one moment. They split where they've been cracked for years, and the weight of denial finally makes the whole structure fall. I left quietly after dinner, slipping on my coat as the shouting carried on behind me. The letter from Dad was folded neatly in my pocket, its words pressed against my palm like a shield. Outside, the night air was cold but clear. I walked to my car slowly, not because I was weary, but because I wanted to feel every step away from that house. Celine may have destroyed herself, but my parents' blindness had almost destroyed me. And as the house crumbled behind me, I knew my healing would not be found within those walls. The lamp on my desk cast a small circle of light across the paper. Outside my apartment window, Denver's skyline glittered with office lights that burned long past business hours, each one a reminder of someone else still carrying the weight of unfinished work. My own work tonight was different. It wasn't about bills or reports or responsibilities. It was about closure. The pen felt heavier than it should have, as if every word I wrote would anchor me to the truth. For years, Celine had written the story of who I was, the overlooked sister, the one in the shadows, the convenient backdrop to her spotlight. She scripted me into silence. But tonight, I wrote the last chapter. The letter from my father lay folded at the edge of my desk. I had read it so many times the crease was wearing thin. His words still rang in me. "You are stronger than you believe." He should have said them years ago, but having them now was enough to steady my hand. In America, you're not just born with your name, you fight to define it. And tonight, I would walk into my family's house not as a victim of Celine's schemes, but as the author of my own ending. The family had insisted on another dinner, a healing gathering, they called it. I knew better. Healing couldn't be staged around a table with casseroles and side dishes. Still, I would go. Not to reconcile, to close. Celine didn't come. Her absence was louder than any presence could have been. The chair at the far end of the table, her throne since childhood, sat empty. Once, it had been draped with pride, the place for the star of the family. Tonight, it was just a chair. I slid an envelope onto it. Crisp white paper, my words sealed inside. Not venom, not apology, simply truth. Mom's eyes caught the movement immediately. "What's this supposed to mean?" she asked, her voice sharp from exhaustion. I kept my gaze steady. "It means I won't sit by the restroom anymore." "That seat belongs to someone else now." Forks paused midair. The room hushed as though someone had blown out every candle. Uncle James shifted in his chair, muttering, "She's not even here to read it." "That's the point," I said. "She doesn't need to read it. I do." Mom bristled. "You're making a scene." I leaned back, calm. The loudest words I ever spoke were written on paper and left behind. If Celine wants to know what they say, she can open the envelope. If she doesn't, that's her choice. But either way, my silence is over. Relatives exchanged glances, but no one dared argue. The weight of the gesture filled the room heavier than shouting ever could. For once, I didn't need to raise my voice. Later that night, when the dishes were scraped clean and the awkward small talk faded, my phone rang. The name flashing on the screen made me pause. Cressida. I stepped onto the porch before answering. "Hello?" Her voice was low, almost tired. "I warned you he could destroy her." "Now you've seen it yourself." "Yes," I said, watching the moon glint off the driveway. "I saw it." "You didn't save her." The words landed like stones, but they didn't crush me. "No, I chose not to." Silence stretched, then Cressida sighed. "And you were right not to. She built the fire. She stood in it. None of us could have pulled her out without burning ourselves too." I closed my eyes, guilt flickering, but clarity stronger. "Some lessons can't be taught," I whispered. "They have to be survived." Cressida hummed in agreement, then hung up without goodbye. The call left me with a strange calm. Guilt was there, yes, but it was no longer poisonous. I hadn't abandoned Celine. I had simply refused to shield her from the consequences she'd earned. The world moved fast after that. News spread quickly. Celine had lost her position in public relations. The board cited ethical concerns, but everyone knew what that meant. Her engagement evaporated. Her fiancé vanished from social media, his profile scrubbed of every picture that once included her smile. Debt notices followed, courtesy of Indira's schemes. Creditors called. Old colleagues who once adored her stopped returning messages. Even her closest friends distanced themselves, suddenly too busy. At family gatherings, the air fractured further. Mom clung to Celine, her arms wrapped tight as though love could stitch over dishonor. Dad remained quiet, detached, though this time his silence didn't feel like cowardice, it felt like surrender. The others looked on with a mix of pity and disdain, but no one denied the truth anymore. I didn't feel joy. I didn't celebrate. Vindication is not champagne. It doesn't bubble or sparkle. It settles, clean and quiet, like drinking water after years of poison. Revenge didn't taste sweet. It tasted pure. Weeks later, I stood once more in the dining room. The table was smaller now, fewer relatives willing to gather. Celine's chair still sat empty, untouched since that night. I placed the envelope back on it, this time unsealed, my words visible. I am no longer your shadow. No dramatic speech, no confrontation, just paper on a chair, my closure laid bare. She lived for the stage, I lived for peace, and in the end, peace outlasts applause. I turned and left without waiting for anyone's response. To anyone listening now, never let someone else write your ending. Sometimes the strongest revenge is survival, with your dignity intact. That night, I didn't just close my sister's chapter, I opened my own.